Hi everyone, and welcome to the Research for Social Impact podcast presented by the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology. My name is Susan Pizzati and I'm the Principal Industry Fellow in Social Impact here at CSI Swinburne, and I'm delighted to be your host for this series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're producing this podcast today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. For those of you who may not be familiar with CSI Swinburne, we're a highly industry-engaged, practice-oriented research and teaching centre based at Swinburne School of Business, Law and Entrepreneurship. We're one of 4 university-based nodes of the highly respected CSI National Network, which also includes the University of New South Wales, Flinders University and the University of Western Australia. So throughout this series, we'll be bringing you conversations, interviews and information from our researchers, sector experts, industry partners, and even our students and alumni, aligned with our core areas of work, which include social entrepreneurship, social finance and investment, measuring and communicating social impact, community services innovation, and employment service system reform for marginalised groups. For our first episode, we wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you to CSI Swinburne and the work of the centre in some more detail. So I've invited our new centre director, Professor Erin Wilson, to join us as our inaugural guest. Erin has worked at CSI Swinburne since 2019 as a highly valued member of the senior leadership team. She's renowned both in Australia and internationally for her extensive body of work in outcomes measurement, community services innovation and disability employment. Erin's work aims to deliver highly relevant, impactful knowledge and education that makes a tangible difference to our partners, our students, policy and practice. And we're delighted to have Erin joining us on this first episode. Hi, Erin. Thanks for agreeing to be our first cab off the podcasting rank for us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Susan. I'm really looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So I've provided a very short overview about your work in my introduction, but since joining CSI, one of the things that I've found most fascinating is the incredibly diverse backgrounds and skills of the team. So it'd be fantastic if we could start today by hearing a little bit more about your journey into this role.
Thanks, Susan. Yes, I quite like to share the journey often with students because people sometimes think it's a linear trajectory, and of course it's not. We've all come from various backgrounds and tried out different things, and it's great, I think, for people to know that it is a journey and there's no one way to wherever you're heading. And look, probably I never had a good sense of where I was heading in that journey. I was like a lot of young people when they left school, didn't really know what they wanted to do. Started working at a bank, decided that was not what I wanted to do. So that was a pretty clear first indication, and then went on to university and did a Bachelor of Arts and then, an honours program. And I actually started off doing a PhD in history in quite a strange circumstance. I may return to that when I retire, but that never got finished. And as people did back then, we got allured off to other things, and the allurement for me was getting in a van and travelling around Australia and ending up in Port Hedland, in the sort of far northwest of Western Australia, and living there for 10 years. So in that time, that was probably my first engagement in the social purpose sector, really, as a person who was paid to be engaged in it at least. And my role there was in regional employment development and community development. I worked a lot with young people in the juvenile justice system, and also with a very wide range of Aboriginal communities and with people who are unemployed. So it was back in the early days when social enterprise in that state at least was called community business. Mm-hmm. And we started one of those for young people with a juvenile justice background, and also ran a work pool for unemployed people and did many other things. So, in many ways I've come back to those roots many, many decades later. And in between, from there, I went on and taught at the Centre for Aboriginal Studies at Curtin University in the Aboriginal Community Management and Development Program, which is a really interesting and great program. And from there, went into a whole range of other fields, particularly rural health with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. And also later, after finishing my PhD, in a different topic, I went into the disability sector and worked for Scope in Victoria, and then took that disability expertise back into the university sector at Deakin University and then ended up here. But my PhD topic in the end turned out to be something quite different from, history, which is where it started. And I was really interested in looking at how we can work with groups that we're not a part of to make social change and how we can work in ways that are not oppressive. So it was really trying to pull through everything I'd learnt from that great experience in the Pilbara and being taught by a whole range of Indigenous mentors and colleagues and non-Indigenous mentors and colleagues, and just really trying to work out how do we do that work without, being oppressive in the way that we work.
Fascinating. And such I think, a great example of a lot of the work that's happening in the space now is CSI Swinburne as well. We're taking that practical perspective and combining it with academic insights and knowledge to hopefully create something that can be really impactful.
Yeah, yep, you're right, Susan. And, thinking back to that PhD, it really included a framework for research in that space, a framework for community development in that space, and a framework for teaching. So I was really thinking about the application. I was thinking about, so now that I know this stuff, what do you do with it? And that's always been my interest in what do we do now?
Fantastic. And I guess like you, CSI Swinburne has also been on quite a journey over the last 20 years or so and has had many iterations. So before talking about sort of CSI Swinburne as it is in 2024, can we talk a little bit about what you see that role of education and research in working towards positive social impact is? And you touched a little bit on some of it there, but I'd really love you to sort of expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, look, I think the field of social impact and social purpose is really full of good intentions and lots of people trying to make a difference with good ideas and good intentions. But we know that good intentions often are not sufficient to get the job done well or the job done in a way that's not oppressive to other people. So I think the role of research and education are really important here. In particular, the role of research is one of inquiry. I think to make social change, we have to really deeply understand the context that we're working in. We have to deeply understand the social issue, the causes and roots of that issue, what holds it in place, what the triggers might be to, release that hold and to make change. And so that all that suggests that we really have a very complex picture that we have to build up across the ecosystem. And that's really the role of research, and that's the journey that CSI Swinburne, across all its projects, I think, is involved in. So that's a really important aspect of what CSI does, is to really intentionally try and identify all those pieces of knowledge that fit together into the solution. And I think in terms of the education space, the second step of that is really the capacity building for action element of it, which I guess I started talking about earlier as well, in the sense that it's all very well to know something, but then we have to know how to do it or how to enact it. And that might be enacting it in practice. It might be enacting it in service design. It might be enacting it in an investment design. It might be enacting it through policy or legislation. And so that's actually not as simple as it sounds. So, people need support to engage in that journey of learning about, well, how do I then do this work? How do I take this knowledge and enact it appropriately? And I think that is both the role of research translation as well as the role of education and capacity building. And that's what I've really liked about CSI, that it has a very strong focus on that translation piece, whereas perhaps in some of my roles in other academic institutions and capacities, the focus has been more on, knowledge production and research and perhaps more formal teaching. And we do both of those things at CSI, absolutely. But I think what's interesting about CSI is the very strong focus on application. How do we use this to do what we need to do with it to address that social issue or problem that we're trying to address? So I think our teaching work focuses there, but we spend a lot of time really trying to work out, what's the research output that is both useful and will be used? And that could be a whole range of things. And that's one of the things I've loved at CSI since I've been here since 2019, that it really has been thinking about what's the knowledge output that's needed here, and not just go to the default of it's a report or it's a journal article or whatever it might be, but really thinking about what would make this knowledge used. We're not always funded to deliver that, but where we can build that into the program, I love that we're really thinking about it.
That's great. And I guess one of the purposes of having this conversation today and creating the podcast is also about trying to fill that gap in terms of making that information and that academic research in particular really accessible to a different kind of audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think academia is an interesting space because to some extent academics speak to each other, partly because that's the audience in front of them. Academics are very fortunate to have access to all of, the journal articles and book chapters that are often behind paywalls and no one can get hold of. And I know people in the sector for a long time across all my roles have asked me about how they can access those things. And there are some real disparities in that, which is problematic. But even should they be able to get access, a lot of those knowledge products are also not that accessible in the end. They may not be about translating to practice or to policy. So, I think, yes, that's the focus of CSI across all of the nodes, but CSI Swinburne, given that that's what we're talking about, is to try and think about ways to do that translation. I hope this podcast can be one of those ways that as we bury into some of the other programs of work that we're doing and some of the research and other activities that we can get some accessible translations out to people, and we'd be really interested in people's feedback about what works in that space, because we're all still learning about what's the easiest way to take up knowledge, knowing there's so many knowledge and information channels now. We don't want to just speak for the sake of speaking.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. And it brings us, I guess, to some questions around academic research and the importance of academic research in the context of social impact and the sector. And I'd be really interested in your perspective here, Erin, both on that initial question, but just the difference between academic research and other kinds of research and what it brings.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a complex one because in some ways we're talking about different types of knowledge and the credit that's given to different types of knowledge, with academic knowledge often being judged as being, the best quality type of knowledge, if you like. I think there's some real problems with that assessment. It's been a lot of movement over a long time really to challenge this notion of what sorts of knowledge are most important or most creditable. And, I think the movement around lived experience knowledge is a great example of that, and around Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing are great examples that challenge the paradigm that says it's academic knowledge that is the top of the rung. However, having said that, we also live in an age where we've got, massive social media. We're flooded with information from a whole range of sources we can't even see, the origin of. So we do have to be careful about, knowledge and how it's produced and for what purpose and under what conditions and under what ethical principles it's produced. So I think that's where the academic lens or the academic context can be helpful. It certainly adds quite a number of layers of both rigour in terms of peer review across a whole range of contexts and of ethical requirements. So I think what that says is then that we know that if we're looking at academic knowledge, it's gone through a range of processes to get to the state that it's in at the end. So that's an important element, I think, to help us make some judgments about it. And generally too, academic knowledge, part of its rigour is to disclose how it was generated. Yeah. So to show the methods, to explain, where the information came from, under what circumstances, how much information is there, what were the parameters of the inquiry. Now, all of that does sound very academic and somewhat tedious, but actually it's really important because often we see knowledge and even sometimes in academic studies, we look at the study and, we might make assessments about whether or not we think that might be interesting, but it's emerging. There's still not enough evidence yet. The study was of quite a small sample or in a particular context and didn't include some other people. So we make judgments all the time in an academic context about what's what's the state of the knowledge, I think. And that's something that's much more transparent in an academic context. So it's not to say that academic knowledge is better per se, or always better than other types of knowledge, but it's to say that it should at least be transparent about its methods and its extensiveness, I think. So that's really helpful. I've probably forgotten the first part of that question.
No, that's great. And even you've just made me think too about the generalisability of research. And I think that's something that's really interesting as well from an academic perspective in terms of how careful we often are about what can be generalised from specific studies. And you talked about the parameters a little bit there.
Yeah. And look, I think this is really, again, complicated. Often people and governments who commission research would like to get an easy answer at the end, would like a sort of an answer almost for all time, or an answer, a clear answer for right now. And as you've highlighted, often, the knowledge we produce is from a particular context, and that context is really important. And I have seen some examples recently. We've had a recent example inside CSI Swinburne, actually, where we were commissioned to do a piece of research on an evidence set and a particular practice that came from another country and other countries, and it was transplanted into Australia, and that actually failed in that instance. And the interesting thing there is that we, have made an assumption, or someone's made an assumption at some point, that because there's an evidence set in one context, it'll be relevant to another context. And so I think there is a kind of literacy that we need to evolve around making assessments of knowledge and evidence, not expecting that it's going to answer all things in all contexts, understanding what it does answer, understanding what's yet to be explored, and knowing that this is a kind of never-ending journey, really. So, yes, I think if we can build some more literacy in that space, it'd be really helpful. Although I can completely understand people's, desire for the solution. Wouldn't that be gorgeous?
It'd be lovely.
Yeah.
And speaking of some of that research, can you talk to us a little bit about the work that CSI Swinburne has underway at the moment? Are there some specific projects that you're getting particularly excited about?
We've got so much on at the moment. It's so interesting. I really love the work that we're doing. We've got such a wide suite of work, and perhaps people don't know, but, we often carry 20 or more projects at a time. So there's a lot of work on, but we also really work to establish those in programs of work, because as I said at the beginning, we have to deeply understand a problem, a social problem, its construction, what holds it in place. So we're always trying to get these pieces of the puzzle. So in some ways, we're out trying to find the projects that are going to fill that piece of the puzzle. And we've got some nice programs of work where we've really progressed. And I know people will know that CSI Swinburne's been renowned for its work in the social enterprise space over many years, that, was really developed by our colleagues Jo Barraquette and Libby Ward-Christie, and has continued to be evolved at Swinburne since they've moved on. So it's a really strong piece of work, which is great to continue. And a second program of work that overlaps with that is that of disability employment. And we've been doing a lot in that space over the last few years that many people will be aware of. And I love that that's now coalescing with the social enterprise space, and that we're learning across the two programmatic areas is really interesting. So I'm particularly excited about the work that we're doing with Australian disability enterprises in that space, knowing that, we're at a point of evolution for that model. And that sector needs support to evolve as well in lots of ways, not just in practice, but also in its funding model or its business model. And, I'm really interested in the work to be done in that space and the interface with some of the broader changes in Commonwealth legislation like the NDIS. So they're two pieces of work, but we've also got our ongoing work in outcomes measurement and outcome and impact evaluation. And we're doing some really interesting stuff there with local government, which is challenging and hard and not easy to solve, but very interesting, as well as other areas of work in community services, innovation, and of course in the philanthropic space. So we've got these interesting programs of work, but I love that they're all intersecting at the moment. So there's a lot of synergy across projects. And I really like that. I think it's a very valuable space for CSI Swinburne, that we can learn from different areas of work. Because often what happens in research is you get very buried in your own little topic area. And, there are a dozen other researchers in the world that are doing your topic area, and you all know what each other's doing. And then if you can lift your head above the fence of that topic area and look across, you can suddenly see that, wow, okay, this is really interesting. There's some other interesting learnings in these other areas. So when I first came back to CSI, or came to CSI in 2019 and came back to a broader community sector focus, broader than what I was just doing prior to that, which was disability and inclusion, I found that really stimulating and interesting to see where the learnings had gotten to in those other areas, and then what we could learn from each other. So I think that's one of the great pluses of the way we've framed these programs of work and the interaction we have between them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You've just reminded me of a book that I've read recently called Range. I don't know whether you've heard of that.
No.
And we can put some links to it in the show notes, but it talks a lot about the benefits of not only specialists but also generalists.
Yeah.
And how having that different perspective can really help in terms of bringing an innovative lens and looking at things differently from a different context, and how that can really uplift where you're going with a certain piece of work. So it's just reminded me then of what you're talking about with all of those different topics that we're working on throughout the centre, and the ability to sort of have that awareness and to dip in and dip out of different conversations, I think is really beneficial.
And that's just completely justified that very messy CV I just gave you at the beginning. So I love it. I'm going to use that one.
Go the generalists.
Yep.
Fantastic. And so where do you see the biggest opportunities or challenges even for research and education in the social purpose sector?
Yeah, there's so many issues and needs in the social purpose sector, so I won't, have a stab at trying to prioritise what they are. But in relation to research and education, I think one of the problems of research in Australia is partly the way it's funded and commissioned. Unlike some other countries, in America, some of the evidence centres have endowments. They've got some underpinning funding which allows them to go and chase solutions to particular gaps and problems. In Australia, typically what happens is research is commissioned, or it's funded by grant funds of some kind, whether they're government or from the sector. And that's terrific, and it's great that there is that investment. But the limitation of that is it's project by project by project. And this also comes out in the academic evidence when we look at the evidence around evidence centres, or this kind of, social change evidence. It is that it's problematic when we have it project by project, because it is, in some senses it's good because it's directed by the sector, but in other ways it's not good because there's not a capacity to join the dots. And that's the thing that I find most challenging, is that you can see across, as I said, we might have 20 or 30 projects, on the books at a time, and we can look across those, and we've got the same the year before, and we can start to see trends, we can see gaps. We can see the piece of work that needs to be done, but we can't get that piece of work funded. And this is not a pitch. I'm not trying to write a funding pitch, but I guess having been in this space for, quite a number of decades, this is the ongoing problem, is how do you fund the piece of knowledge building that's needed, and then the piece of capacity building from the knowledge after that. And we often don't get that capacity building piece funded. We've had a couple of great examples, I think, at the centre in the time that I've been here, and I'm sure there's been others, prior to this. I think the Community Services Outcomes Tree was a really interesting example of the sector. It was funded by Uniting VicTAS. They may or may not have intended it to be this way, but it turned out that it was a gift really to the sector as a whole, that we were able to do that piece of research work that looked at all of the outcomes and instruments around outcomes measurement across the community services sector, pull those together into a framework, get it on a website, develop a method for data collection, a short survey template, a method of reporting, and suddenly that's used by 20,000 people, So suddenly if you can get it right, I think, there are other examples. The Social Startup Studio is another example of a resource that's really worked. I think the Seed Kit platform that was launched last year with the University of Melbourne is another example that's likely to do the same thing. And they're sort of translation solutions often quite hard to get the funding to do that. But then we've also got that other challenge of the knowledge gap solution. That's an issue. A good example of fixing that was Inclusion Australia funded us a couple of years ago to do some work on an evidence for reform series around disability employment for people with intellectual disability. And what that did was give us the capacity to look across a whole range of our projects and our research work and the research of others and pull it together into a strong ecosystem analysis of what's going on here, where are the issues, what do we know about the issues, what's the direction of change we need to move in, where are the levers of change. And we almost never get to do that kind of joining the dots work. So that's my frustration. I can often feel like we're sort of on the edge of the seat. And if we could just get the momentum to just go that bit further, we could probably crack it. You know, we often have conversations amongst the team where we can see these pieces and we can see these findings, but we can't quite get enough evidence to take it to the next stage. Yeah.
It's a challenge and leads me on to what is actually my final question, and a question that I plan to ask all of our guests over the course of the podcast series. I'd really love to know, Erin, if you had $1 million to put towards a new piece of social impact research or education, what would you spend it on?
Oh, there was a time when I thought $1 million was a lot of money. Unfortunately, not so much these days. It's a really tricky one. But I think, to me, I'd love to have $1 million to plug that gap, to be able to say, if you're on the cusp of something, can we just invest in that next bit that's really going to crack it?
Yep.
And I'm sure that's true for many other programs of work around Australia and internationally, and, you know, other organisations that are doing great work. You know, they're sort of on the cusp of something and they just need that bit more, would be fantastic. So, yes, I'd love to be able to have that money in my back pocket to be able to invest in that next step of joining the dots and gap filling. And, you know, to some extent, you know, we try and do a bit of that when we talk to those organisations that do invest in this work, and even invest in the intervention space as well. You know, there's a real need at the moment. There's a range of disability employment programs that are probably likely to end soon because, you know, the government investment in them in the grant cycle is ending. We can see from our evidence when we look across some of those, there's some really great examples of interventions that work, and there are some clusters of them too. There's actually now some clustering of evidence in that space. But what's next needed in that space, for instance, is to build the business model of how would you be able to sustain that intervention if you didn't have, you know, 100% of grant funding. And as often happens in this space, those organisations weren't commissioned to do that piece of work. So they were commissioned to do the build of the intervention. They've done it, they've tested it, they've worked out it works, and now probably it'll end. This is, I know everyone will be thinking, gosh, how often have I heard this cycle? And it is that next piece. So I think the $1 million is the next piece, whatever that next piece is, that just gets us to fixing the problem in a sustainable way.
Love that. Thank you, Erin. It's been so wonderful to have the chance to chat with you today. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure we'll be looping back with you in a lot of the future episodes when we dive a little bit more deeply into some of that program content that you've mentioned today. But if people would like to contact you to get any more information, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Probably the best way is via email, so ewilson@swin.edu.au, or I do have a LinkedIn page as well. If you wanted to try and find me there, I'd be happy to connect that way. But email's a good way, so you'll find us through the show notes, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of our very first episode. We hope you enjoyed hearing from Erin, learning more about her career journey and the evolution of CSI Swinburne. I'd like to take the opportunity to say a huge thanks to our producer, Christy Horn, who's done an amazing job pulling everything together behind the scenes to bring this podcast to fruition. As we're a new podcast, we'd really appreciate your help in spreading the word about what we're doing. So please feel free to share this episode with anyone who you think might be interested in research for social impact. And being researchers, we're always keen to gather data, so we'd love to hear what you've thought of this episode. Feel free to contact us with any feedback or suggestions you might have for future topics, or you can always like or leave a review on this episode on Spotify. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you can join us again soon.